Rome didn't fall because of barbarians. It fell because it went bankrupt. The same financial system that built the Colosseum, that funded legions across 3 continents, that created the greatest infrastructure project in human history, that system ate the empire from the inside out. And here's the kicker. We're using the exact same playbook today. If you've ever wondered why empires that seem invincible just collapse, you're about to find out. Because Rome's story isn't ancient history. It's a warning label we keep ignoring. And before we go any further, if you want to understand how money actually runs the world, hit that subscribe button. Because we're about to reverse engineer an empire. Let's start with something that doesn't make sense. In 27 BC, Rome controlled the Mediterranean. They had professional armies, engineering marvels, and a tax base that should have made them untouchable for centuries. Yet by 476 AD, the Western Empire was gone. Not slowly declining, gone. The usual explanation? Barbarian invasions, moral decay, lead poisoning. But here's what they don't tell you. Rome was technically bankrupt long before the first Goth crossed the frontier. The empire had been running on borrowed money for so long that when the credit finally dried up, the whole structure came apart in less than a generation. To understand how that happened, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when Rome invented something that would change warfare forever, the credit market. Picture this. It's 264 BC. Rome is a regional power in Italy, nothing special. Carthage controls the Mediterranean with the greatest navy on earth. Rome has basically no navy. Common sense says this is a mismatch. Rome should stay in their lane. But Rome doesn't have common sense. They have something better. They have credit. Here's the problem Rome faced. Building a fleet from scratch costs a fortune. We're talking hundreds of warships, trained crews, supply chains. The Roman treasury doesn't have that kind of cash lying around. So what do? They invent a system where wealthy Roman citizens lend the state money in exchange for bonds, essentially IOUs that promise repayment with interest once the war is won. This is revolutionary. Before Rome, if you wanted to fight a war, you needed gold in the vault. Rome said, we don't need gold now. We need gold later. We'll borrow against future victory. And it worked. Rome built the fleet, defeated Carthage, and suddenly everyone wanted Roman bonds, because Roman bonds paid. But here's where it gets interesting. Once you prove you can borrow money, win a war, and pay it back with the profits from conquest, you've created a machine. A machine that runs on one simple fuel: future victory. The Roman elite saw this immediately. If the state can borrow to build armies, and armies bring back plunder and land, and that land generates taxes, and those taxes pay off the bonds, you've just created a perpetual motion machine for wealth. Except it's not perpetual. It just looks that way for about 400 years. Let's talk about how the credit system actually worked, because this is where Rome gets sophisticated. By the 1st century BC, Rome had developed a full-spectrum financial market that would look familiar to anyone on Wall Street today. You had publicani, private companies that bid on government contracts, tax farming rights, military supply chains, infrastructure projects. These weren't just businesses, they were publicly traded. Romans bought and sold shares in these companies in the Forum. There were even something like stock exchanges, where prices fluctuated based on news from the provinces. If word came that a publicani company had secured a rich silver mine in Spain, their share price would spike. If a tax farming contract in Asia Minor went bad, shares would crash. The Romans had created financial derivatives 2,000 years before derivatives were supposed to exist. But the real innovation was how emperors used debt as a political weapon. Here's the mechanic. Let's say you're Emperor Augustus. You want to keep the population of Rome happy because happy Romans don't riot. So you need bread and circuses. Literally, grain subsidies and gladiator games. But you also need to pay 30 legions stationed across the empire. And You need to build roads and aqueducts, because infrastructure is what makes the empire functional. Problem: your tax revenue doesn't cover all of this. Solution: you borrow. You issue bonds to wealthy senators and equestrians. They lend you money now. You promise to pay them back later with interest. Everyone wins. The emperor gets to fund his projects. The elite get a safe, guaranteed return, and the population gets bread and blood sports. But here's the catch. This only works if you can keep paying the interest. And to pay the interest, you need revenue. And to get revenue, you need economic growth, or conquest. For the first 2 centuries of the empire, this wasn't a problem. Rome was still expanding. Every new province brought new taxpayers, new resources, new revenue streams. The debt was growing, sure, but so was the empire. The machine was still working. Then something changed. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the 160s AD, Rome had stopped expanding. The empire had reached its natural borders. The Germans to the north were too poor to conquer profitably. The Parthians to the east were too strong to beat without massive cost. The deserts to the south had nothing worth taking. This is the moment everything breaks. Because Rome's financial system wasn't designed for a steady-state empire, it was designed for growth. Continuous, aggressive, profitable growth. When the growth stopped, the math stopped working. Let me show you the numbers. At its peak, Rome was spending roughly 70 to 80% of its annual revenue just on the military. Not building new infrastructure, not investing in technology, just maintaining the legions that defended the borders. Add in the grain dole for the city of Rome, the bureaucracy, the emperor's household, and you're running at a deficit every single year. So what do? You borrow more. You issue more bonds. You push the problem into the future. And here's where human psychology becomes financial policy. Because no emperor wants to be the one who cuts benefits or reduces the army. That's political suicide. So instead, they do what every government in history does when they're in this position. They debase the currency. Currency debasement is a beautiful scam. Here's how it works. Roman coins were supposed to be made of pure silver. Let's say a denarius, the standard silver coin, was supposed to weigh X grams of pure silver. But if you're the emperor and you need more money, you don't need to find more silver. You just reduce the silver content. You mix in copper or bronze. You make the coin look the same, but it's only 90% silver. Then 80%. Then 50%. You just created money out of thin air. In the short term, this is genius. You can mint more coins, pay your soldiers, fund your projects, and nobody notices immediately. But in the long term, you've just created inflation. Because eventually people catch on. They realize the coins aren't worth what they used to be. Prices rise. The coins buy less. And you have to debase even more just to keep up. By the 3rd century AD, the denarius had gone from nearly pure silver to less than 5% silver. The coin that had built an empire was now basically worthless. And here's the death spiral. When your currency collapses, people stop accepting it. They demand payment in gold or goods. Your soldiers stop getting paid. Your tax collectors can't collect because nobody wants your worthless coins. Your whole administrative structure, built on the assumption that money means something, falls apart. But the currency crisis was just a symptom. The real disease was the debt. Because Rome had spent centuries borrowing against the future, and the future had arrived. Let's talk about tax farming, because this is where the perverse incentives really kick in. Tax farming was Rome's way of outsourcing tax collection. Instead of building a giant government bureaucracy to collect taxes across the empire, Rome auctioned off the rights to collect taxes in specific provinces. You'd bid for the right to collect, say, all the taxes in Asia Minor for 5 years. You'd pay Rome a lump sum up front. Then you'd go collect the taxes yourself. Whatever you collected above what you paid Rome, you kept as profit. On paper, this is efficient. Rome gets its money up front. Private collectors have an incentive to be efficient. Everyone wins. In practice, this created a nightmare. Because if you're a tax farmer and you've paid Rome a huge sum for the right to collect taxes, you need to extract as much as possible from the province to make a profit. You're not thinking about the long-term economic health of the region. You're thinking about maximizing revenue in your 5-year window. So you overtax, you squeeze, you push peasants into debt, you force landowners to sell property to cover tax bills. You hollow out the local economy. And Rome doesn't care, because Rome already got paid. The tax farmers got rich. The senators who lent money to the tax farming companies got their returns. But the provinces, the actual economic base of the empire, started to rot. By the 4th century, you had entire regions where peasants were abandoning their land because they couldn't afford the taxes. You had cities shrinking because the middle class was being destroyed by debt and taxation. The empire was eating its own foundation. And here's the cruel irony. The more the provinces weakened, the more Rome needed to extract from them. Because the military budget wasn't shrinking, the barbarian pressure was increasing. The borders needed more troops, not fewer. So Rome borrowed more, taxed more, debased more, and the cycle accelerated. Now let's add the final ingredient, the creditors. By the late empire, the people who held Rome in debt weren't just Roman senators, they were barbarian kings, Germanic tribal leaders, Gothic warlords. Because here's what happened. Rome started paying some barbarian tribes in gold to not invade. It was cheaper than fighting them. This is the subsidy system. You pay the Goths a yearly tribute to stay peaceful. You pay the Vandals to guard a section of the border. You pay the Franks to fight other barbarians. This works for a while. But now you've created a new problem. The barbarians are getting rich off Roman gold. They're learning Roman military tactics. They're integrating into the Roman economy. And they're holding Roman debt. Some Gothic kings were creditors to the Roman state. They had lent Rome money. They owned Roman bonds. Think about what this means. The people you're paying to defend you are also the people you owe money to. And if you can't pay, what leverage do you have? This is the endgame. By the 5th century, Rome couldn't pay its debts. It couldn't pay its soldiers. It couldn't maintain the infrastructure. The tax base had collapsed. The currency was worthless. And the creditors, many of whom were now barbarian warlords, realized they didn't need to invade Rome. They just needed to stop propping it up. When Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor in 476 AD, it wasn't a military conquest, it was a foreclosure. The empire had been running on borrowed money for so long that when the credit dried up, there was nothing left. No gold in the treasury, no functioning currency, no tax base, just debt and the ruins of a system that had forgotten the one rule of finance. You can't borrow forever. So what's the lesson? Rome's credit system wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It allowed Rome to punch above its weight for centuries, to build an empire that should have been impossible. But it created an addiction to future growth, to borrowed money, to pushing problems down the road. And when the growth stopped, the system couldn't adapt. It could only collapse. The scary part? We're doing the exact same thing. Modern governments run on deficit spending, on bonds and debt instruments, on the assumption that economic growth will always continue, that future generations will always be richer, that we can always borrow more. Rome thought that too. For 400 years it worked, until it didn't. The Roman elites didn't think they were destroying the empire. They thought they were managing it. Every debasement was temporary. Every new tax was necessary. Every loan was strategic. But each decision made sense in isolation. The problem was the system. Once you build an empire on debt, every decision becomes about servicing that debt. And eventually, the debt becomes bigger than the empire itself. That's when you get the collapse. Not because of barbarians or moral decay or lead pipes. Because the math stopped working. If there's one thing you take from this, it's this. Rome's fall wasn't ancient history. It's a case study. A warning written in denarii and debt. Because the tools that built the Colosseum are the same tools that made the empire too expensive to defend. And we're still using those tools today. If you want to understand how the invisible hand of incentives shapes everything from empires to your own economy, subscribe. Because history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, we're hearing a very familiar tune.